Wait until you hear what happens in this debate.
Ask voters, how much do you blame Trump for the current rate of inflation? 59% say a great deal, a good amount.
Well, he's the president. He is the head that wears the crown.
Exactly. He is the president.
But why go back to the people with the shovel digging the hole?
To note that the inflation that occurred under Biden was in part naturally occurring due to supply chain bottlenecks and because the COVID once-in-a-lifetime pandemic occurred. And yes, it occurred.
Like we're on trees?
Yeah, okay. So, because of supply chain bottlenecks.
Something interesting unfolded on CNN during Abby Phillip's panel discussion. Emma Vigeland from the Majority Report appeared on the program and ended up in a direct clash with Scott Jennings, a familiar conservative voice who rarely backs down from an argument. The exchange quickly turned into a sharp debate as the panel weighed in on the issue, with both sides pushing very different interpretations of what was happening. We're going to walk through several moments from that discussion featuring Emma Vigeland, Scott Jennings, and the rest of the table. After watching the segment, there are a few things that stood out to me that are worth unpacking. So let's break down the clips and talk through what actually happened.
Representative, he said, Trump swipes money from taxpayers to bail out the farmers who were harmed by the tariffs that Trump himself placed on American businesses and consumers. This is the Trump economy. Senator Flake.
Can't argue with that. On tariffs, tariffs are inflationary. That has been a GOP article of faith forever. And it's true. And we're finding that out. There's been some time to get there. But we're there, certainly, and I think that next year it'll even be worse unless there's some reversal on tariffs. We've seen bits and pieces shift, certain sectors exempt and certain countries exempt, but overall it's starting to bite. Consumers are paying more and they're feeling it. Yeah, and you can't tell them otherwise.
Well, yeah, and Trump is not only trying to tell them otherwise, but is also not acknowledging what his own actions are showing, which is that he's bailing out farmers, rolling back some tariffs on food items. Those seem to be clear acknowledgments that the tariff policy has hurt Americans.
Well, I think on the agriculture piece, there's a couple things going on. One, right up front, Trump said the tariffs were going to cause some short-term turbulence or pain for some sectors. He acknowledged it. Agriculture has felt that a little bit, the row crop guys especially. But, of course, they solved some of that with the deal they cut with China. So actually was
Did they solve that? Because, I mean, I don't think we would.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think we would be talking about a $12 billion bailout, well, A. And B, the amount that China has bought is not anywhere near what has been promised.
Okay, so they cut a deal with China, and they're in better shape today than they were when we didn't have a deal with China. So that's number one. Number two, I was in Texas Saturday night with the Texas Farm Bureau, spoke to a lot of farmers down there. It was interesting. There were some people that absolutely had concerns. In fact, I talked to one guy who was going to the White House meeting today, and they were glad to get invited to that. I think they feel like what the president's doing on the ag thing is responsive to them. They have concerns, not just tariffs. They're a little worried about the Argentinian beef issue as well. They threw that out. So, yeah, I mean, he's got some issues to work out. But overall, if you look at the Fed survey, people are happy and excited about the job market and the labor market in the United States. That's a good thing. And if you talk to Scott Bessent, he'll tell you that they think in 2026, we're going to see a boom in jobs and growth in this country thanks to some of the structural changes they made this year. So they're expressing optimism and exuding optimism, and that's what they got to do going into an election.
There have been more than 1 million jobs lost so far this year, a number that basically rivals the pandemic time. So there is a picture of the economy that we're not getting from the federal government numbers because those numbers are by and large not coming out. But from private sector payrolls, jobs are being lost right now, right at this moment.
We've seen actually for the first time in years, actually job losses month after month, revisions showing private sector job losses. And I think that is driving a lot of anxiety. And it comes at a time where the facts are that the tariffs are causing middle-class families, working-class families, to pay more money. They're $1,700 estimated by the Yale Budget Lab of how much families are paying more for the tariffs. And so I think what's really odd is that the president promised that inflation would come down on day one. He'd get rid of it. And instead, he went on this policy that I agree is just different from what Republicans have supported for decades, which is raising prices on people. And of course, the whole issue with the bailout of the farmers is if we didn't have these actually counterproductive tariffs, you wouldn't have to take taxpayer money to actually bail them out, because China's response on the soybeans is because of the president's tariffs policy.
I know all of human history started in January of this year, but I could take you back 4 years when input prices for agriculture, from fuel to materials to you name it, went through the roof. I know you know a little something about it because you worked under Joe Biden when it all happened. So these farmers, they're in a 10-month period here with Trump, but they just came out of a 4-month period where they were dying under the inflationary and affordability crisis caused by Democrats. They support this president. They like what he did today, and they're going to give him a little latitude to get out of it.
I don't think that's accurate when you hear from farm bureaus.
You don't think it's accurate that inflation happened under Biden?
I'm sorry, Donald Trump talked about, we definitely had inflation, but Joe Biden didn't pass tariffs that actually, with his own policy, actually increased prices for people. And I think what's really stunning is that 1 year in, Donald Trump's approval on economics is actually now worse than Joe Biden's. So all you want to talk about Joe Biden, the fact is people hold Donald Trump responsible because it's his policies.
Scott Jennings has developed a very distinctive approach whenever he appears on Abby Phillip's panel. And if you watch the show regularly, the pattern becomes impossible to miss. No matter what topic is on the table, the conversation almost always gets redirected towards something Democrats supposedly did years ago. A discussion might begin with a present-day policy decision, a statement made by a current political figure, or a specific event happening right now. But within moments, the debate gets pulled backward into the past. Suddenly, the focus shifts to Joe Biden, Barack Obama, or even figures from decades earlier. The tactic is familiar. Instead of staying focused on the subject being discussed, the conversation becomes an exercise in deflection through historical comparison. This kind of rhetorical maneuver is extremely common among commentators aligned with the MAGA movement. Rather than directly responding to the argument or evidence being presented, the strategy often involves reframing the debate so that it becomes about something else entirely. If criticism is raised about one political figure, the response quickly becomes a reference to another administration or another controversy from years ago. It's not necessarily about resolving the issue. It's about diluting it. By introducing multiple past examples, the goal is to blur accountability in the present moment. In effect, every conversation becomes a debate about history instead of an evaluation of what is actually happening now. What makes this especially noticeable on Abby Phillip's panel is the contrast between how different guests approach these discussions. When someone like Emma Vigeland appears, the style of argument tends to look very different. Her contributions usually revolve around citing specific examples, presenting context, or pointing to concrete evidence that supports the point she's making. Whether someone agrees with her or not, the structure of the argument is clear. There's a claim, there's supporting information, and there's an explanation of how the two connect. On the other side of the table, the arguments coming from MAGA-aligned commentators frequently rely more on narrative framing than on factual grounding. The irony, of course, is that the same political circles often champion the phrase facts over feelings. Yet during these debates, the positions being expressed are often driven less by documented information and more by personal interpretation or partisan instinct. The language becomes emotional, the framing becomes rhetorical, and the emphasis shifts away from evidence toward persuasion. There's also another layer to how these debates play out, and that's the performance aspect. Political panels are not just discussions. They're also television. Many commentators are very aware that they're speaking not only to the people at the table, but also to the audience watching from home. Scott Jennings, in particular, has developed a habit that viewers have probably noticed: the repeated direct stare into the camera during exchanges. Instead of focusing solely on the other panelists, he frequently turns toward the lens, almost as if he's addressing viewers directly. It's a small detail, but once you notice it, it's hard to unsee. The camera glance becomes part of the presentation, almost like a signature move. It raises an interesting question about how much of these panel debates are genuine discussion, and how much of them are carefully crafted performances meant to resonate with a broader audience beyond the studio. Television punditry often operates on that balance. Debate for the panel, messaging for the viewers. Watching these segments unfold, you start to see how the dynamics of modern political commentary work. There's the argument itself, the strategy behind the argument, and the delivery of the argument. Each layer plays a role in shaping how viewers interpret the conversation. And in the case of these Abby Phillip panels, the contrast between styles, evidence-driven versus narrative-driven, discussion versus performance, becomes one of the most revealing parts of the entire exchange.
People are just not feeling it. They're just not seeing how great it is, or that we just have to remind them that this is a PR problem and not an actual economic problem.
Well, Abby, I think we should put some of the president's comments into context. I think he is taking some of the celebrations on the prices that have come down, like we've talked about on your show before, prices on fuel, certain food items that are in fact coming down. And I think this, Scott's absolutely right. We should celebrate the fact that Americans are looking at this job market and saying we have a better chance at getting good, high-paying jobs and being able to support ourselves and our families. So, look, this is a reality that the American people are facing. The vice president came out and said, stick with us, give us some time, show a little grace on this issue. The president has said, hey, we're 11 months in.
Why should they show
and I think, and I do think.
That's the part I don't understand.
Well, and I do think, Abby,
why should we show grace?
I honestly want to know.
We ask
I'm
for the
curious.
same grace.
We don't live in a snap election
this is
system.
As we suffered through 4 years, as I've said before, and I'll continue to say, as the worst inflation in my lifetime.
To your
and
point,
many Americans' lifetime.
This is a president who came into office and he said, this is going to be my top priority.
Yep.
That you all are suffering under the inflation of the Joe Biden administration. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to fix it on day one, he says. Why should then Americans, almost a year into this thing, turn around and say, well, you know, you've raised prices on us through tariffs, but we're going to just give you some grace? That doesn't make any practical sense, and it doesn't make any political sense.
Would it make any sense to go back to the people who caused it in the first place?
No, well, if you ask voters, it's funny
tariffs.
that Trump, for the current rate of inflation, 59% say a great deal, a good amount.
Well, he's the president. He is the head that wears the crown.
Exactly. He is the president.
But why go back to the people with the shovel digging the hole?
To note that the inflation that occurred under Biden was in part naturally occurring due to supply chain bottlenecks and because the COVID once-in-a-lifetime pandemic occurred. And yes, it occurred.
Like we're on trees?
Yeah, okay. So, because of supply chain bottlenecks, that's what I'm talking about. There was a labor shortage
Policy choices were
because
made.
of COVID.
Policy choices
and then there
were
was this thing called greedflation, which was called a left-wing conspiracy theory. But then we saw record returns for corporations in their earnings, which showed that even though prices were going up, they were still taking home record returns, these corporations. And in part, the Biden administration tried to address that with lean econ and more enforcement. Now Trump's in office and there are no cops on the beat. We just hit a record of credit card debt in this country, over $1.2 trillion of credit card debt. We just hit a record in terms of subprime auto delinquencies, showing that people are really hurting. And there's something like the top 1% owns 50% of all stocks and trades. This is an income inequality problem as well as
Trump
a tariff
problem. Trump is also
problem.
blaming greedflation now for rising costs. And so, to your point, it was considered just sort of a Democratic talking point. Now Trump is doing the same thing. Again, you're seeing the same patterns playing out. And just for people at home who are just like, look, it's getting more expensive to live, they're not buying it. They weren't buying it with Joe Biden, and they're not buying it now.
The striking thing is, Republican tax and regulatory policy has been good for the economy. Even with that, you see huge inflation because of tariffs. But President Trump's signature economic policy was tariffs. I love tariffs. It's the most beautiful word in the dictionary. He goes on and on about it. And then when tariffs cause inflation, then he tries to say, no, they don't. But tax and regulatory policy has been favorable for business, but it's the uncertainty and the higher tariffs that are hurting the economy. And that's why the president is running away from it at certain times, or he'll exempt certain sectors or certain countries. But it's going to hurt coming into the elections, believe me, unless there's a reversal.
And he's hearing it from not just from voters, not just from Democrats, but also from Republicans in his own party.
Another interesting moment in that exchange was Jeff Flake acknowledging that the tariffs were harmful and pointing directly to Donald Trump as the reason they exist in the first place. To his credit, that kind of admission is at least honest. But it also raises a larger issue that many people have noticed over the years. Comments like that almost always come after someone leaves office. When politicians are still in power, that kind of blunt criticism rarely surfaces. It's difficult not to wonder whether Flake would have spoken that candidly if he were still serving in the Senate today. Then you have the contrast in how Emma Vigeland approaches these discussions. When she speaks on panels like this, she tends to bring concrete information with her. Statistics, economic figures, policy details, things that can actually be examined and verified. Her arguments are usually structured around data. She lays out numbers, provides context, and explains how those numbers connect to the issue being discussed. Meanwhile, during that same segment, Scott Jennings spends much of the time interrupting. Instead of engaging with the points she's raising, he jumps in while she's still explaining them. You see the same performance patterns as well. The smirks, the side comments, the attempts to derail the explanation before it can fully land. What's noticeable is that Vigeland does not do the same thing when Jennings is speaking. She lets him finish his argument, even when the points he's making are highly partisan. That difference in approach really highlights something about the dynamic of these panel shows. When the conversation moves toward facts, numbers, or policy details, the discussion can become difficult to redirect. Data requires a response. Evidence requires engagement. But when someone interrupts or talks over the explanation, the audience never gets the full context. What you rarely see from MAGA-aligned commentators in these situations is the presentation of verifiable data. There's almost never a chart, a study, or a specific economic indicator being introduced into the conversation. Imagine if Jennings walked onto the show with a graph showing measurable changes, say inflation trends, wage growth, or price changes tied directly to policies he supports. That kind of argument would at least invite a real debate about the numbers. Instead, the discussion often falls back on broad talking points or rhetorical reactions. It becomes more about political positioning than about measurable outcomes. That's why exchanges like this can feel frustrating for viewers who want a substantive conversation about policy rather than a series of partisan soundbites. The unfortunate part is that when someone like Vigeland appears on a panel structured this way, the opportunity for a deeper discussion is limited. She might get a brief window to present information, but the format of the show, multiple commentators, constant crosstalk, and limited time, means that the explanation often gets cut short. It almost makes you wonder how different the conversation would look if the format were changed. A structured one-on-one debate, moderated carefully so that both participants had equal time to speak, would create a completely different dynamic. In that setting, interruptions would be limited, and each person would actually have to respond directly to the other's points. But panel television rarely works that way. The format rewards fast reactions and strong personalities more than slow, detailed policy discussions. And that's exactly what we saw in this segment. So when you watch exchanges like this, the real takeaway isn't just about one clip or one panel discussion. It's about the broader pattern we keep seeing in political media. When someone brings data, numbers, and documented facts into the conversation, the debate should revolve around those facts. But instead, the discussion often shifts toward interruptions, talking points, and emotional reactions rather than engaging with the evidence itself. And that raises a bigger question about the tone of our political discourse. When conversations move away from facts and toward constant deflection or personal attacks, it can contribute to a more hostile political climate overall. At a time when tensions in politics are already high, the way these debates are conducted matters more than people sometimes realize. So what are your thoughts on how rhetoric and media debates can influence the atmosphere around political threats and division in the country? Do you think discussions like this help move the conversation forward, or do they make the environment more polarized? Let me know your perspective down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. That support really does help the channel grow. Until next time, this has been the Policy Vault, where we cut through the noise so you don't have to. Thanks for watching.